Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're halfway through, more or less, the 7th chapter, and well, the chapter starts with Krishna switching gears and telling Arjuna that if he takes shelter of him, Madashraya, and he absorbs his mind in him, Mayi Asakta Mana, then it's possible to know him. Yasyasi, you will know me. Samagram, completely, and asangshayam, without any doubt. And if you also have to practice, so yoga yunjam, you have to practice this. So Krishna lays out that it's possible to know him completely, without any doubts, through a process of taking shelter of him, of practicing, and of absorbing one's mind in Krishna. And then Krishna explains that he's now going to talk about this knowledge, and that once you know this, nothing further remains to be known. And he tells you how rare that is, that out of thousands of people, somebody might even just pursue perfection. Out of thousands of those strivers, and even of thousands of perfected people, maybe one of them knows him. And so it's a very theistic, devotional introduction to the 7th chapter. It's so striking that the Gita is divided into 3 sections by commentators, and this is considered to be the start of the 2nd section of the Gita. And it gets shot out of like a cannon almost in terms of its change in mood and the directness of Krishna's message. And then he explains Sankhya again, which is a philosophy, really like a quantum philosophy. Nowadays, quantum mechanics is the study of quanta, of tiny, irreducible, fundamental particles, and then the fundamental forces. A fundamental particle would be something like a neutrino, which is a sub-atomic particle. And a fundamental force would be something like strong nuclear force, which is what holds atoms together. And so a quantum mechanics, or modern physics, is studying what the smallest fundamental particles of the universe are and the rules by which they interact. And you have Krishna introducing a primitive form of a physics, really what we call an ontology, a theory, a philosophy of what is, what fundamentally exists. And in the 2nd chapter of the Gita, it was spirit and matter. And in the 7th chapter, it's earth, water, fire, air, space, mind, intelligence, and ego are all matter. And then the soul, or consciousness, is spirit. Normally, by the grace of René Descartes, we think of the noumenal world, the noumenal world, the world of mind, that it would include things like thoughts and feelings. But for Krishna, who has a 3-part theory, not a dualistic theory of mind and matter, but a 3-part theory of gross matter, subtle matter, and spirit. And the gross and subtle matter are both material, and spirit is separate. And so subtle matter includes most of what we would think of as being noumenal or spiritual in a dualistic model. Thoughts, feelings, ideas, personality, etc., etc. almost all of that would be included within the field of subtle matter. And consciousness would be the fundamental, the witness that is consciousness. And then, within a spiritual sphere, that witness does have a spiritual form and spiritual qualities. But in this material world, all of the material form and qualities that a soul misidentifies with are not actually the soul. They are the software of the computer as opposed to the hardware, but still entirely distinct from the operator. And Krishna explains that, there's matter in these 8 varieties, and then there's something above it, and that matter is bhina prakriti. It's his bhina mam prakriti. It's his separated energy. And then spirit is his param prakriti, his supreme energy. And that we are therefore above matter. And this is so obvious, self-evident, that a human being or a life form is superior to a rock. It's self-evident. And in fact, you find philosophers going all the way back to Aristotle. In his book on physics, explaining, the different categories of life, and that animals are above plants, and plants are above stones because plants have life, and animals can move, therefore they're above plants, and humans can reason, therefore they're above animals. So this obvious common sense idea has been around for forever. It's obvious that life is superior to matter. But Krishna makes that point. So we won't just think that the entire material world is of the same substance. Rather, within those evolutes from Krishna, there is a separate evolute, and therefore Krishna is not responsible directly for the imperfections of this world. By distancing Krishna from the material world, then things like the temporality of the material world do not affect God. And this is a little tricky, just like for an atheist, explaining how consciousness comes from matter is a problem. It's the hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness come from matter? If my starting point is fundamental particles, like neutrinos, that then become neutrons and become atoms and become molecules and become stuff in this world, how did that stuff become conscious? That's called the hard problem of consciousness. Why would it become conscious? How did it become conscious? Is it conscious? How do you get a unified consciousness from a bunch of distinct chemicals interacting through fundamental forces? Contrastingly, if you start with the idea that God created the world as your starting point, like nobody bothers to argue where matter came from or where the fundamental forces of physics came from. They're assumed. Just like science doesn't bother to ask, where did logic come from? They just assume it. Where did math come from? They just assume it and work with it. Think about it for a minute. You follow? They assume logic, logical relationships between the world. They assume that math, acts in regular ways throughout the world. They assume that experiments yield consistent results, and that that if you have, it's a principle of falsifiability. If you can test something and it regularly shows that it behaves in a certain way, then it's going to tend to behave in that way in the future. But that's an assumption about the nature of the world, that the world is fundamentally logical. And so, irrespective of, and try to listen, irrespective of what your philosophy is, you have to have some starting places so you don't get into infinite regression where you question everything and everything about everything. There has to be a starting point. That the world is real, that the world behaves in regular ways, that by studying the world you can understand the world, that we have the capacity to understand the world, that math is consistent, that logic is consistent, that we can use these tools to understand the world in which we live. Did you follow that? And there's things that science can't teach us, like, for instance, morals. Morals are, that's the whole fact-value distinction. So morals are when you try to derive what's valuable, what has value, what's worth pursuing, what you should do. Aesthetics, what is beautiful. Also, other people's minds. We can't prove other people have minds because your mental state is experienced in the first person. But we look at symptoms that appears your conscious like I am, but you can't prove it empirically. There's all sorts of things we accept, that we have good reason to accept. They're logical, they're reasonable, that go beyond science. And any philosophy has to, assume certain things about the nature of the world and then build from them. You have to have a starting point. And so for a theist, the starting point is that God exists. But then the problem is, how do you get from a spiritual being matter? And how does that not indicate that God is faulty and material? And so within theism, you have to explain how the world comes from God, but that the imperfection of the material world does not indicate an imperfection on the part of God. Do you follow that? So this idea of it's my bina prakriti, it's my material nature, the idea is not random or arbitrary or unnecessary. It's a necessary part of any theistic philosophy, is to explain evil but not have it fall at the feet of God, is to explain imperfection and have it not fall at the feet of God. And so when you look at Vedanta, for instance, you will find this dexterous dance where everything comes from God, but that's a separated energy. Everything's connected to God, but not necessarily directly. You follow? And there's a purpose behind that. You want to flesh out an idea of how everything can be related to divinity, but not actually then have it define divinity in a way that would make divinity less than perfect. So Krishna's beginning to do that. And he explains that everything, has its source in these two natures, and that we are spiritual beings who are now enjoying this world and animating this world. And then Krishna says the whole world is strung on him like pearls are strung on a thread. And then he begins to give you some arguments for that. He says he's the light of the sun and the moon, the heat of fire, the strength of the strong, the intelligence of the intelligent, the fragrance of the earth, the sound Om, the ability of mankind, the strength of the strong, provided that strength is devoid of passion and attachment. But then if it's devoid of desire, kama, raga, vivarjitam, free from desire and attachment. But then where does desire come from? I'm also desire. Provided it's not, it is dharma aviruddha. It's not dharma viruddha. It's not against dharma. Provided it's not against dharma, then I'm even that desire. And most of the commentators say that is sex for procreation. Because kam, desire, also means sex. So most of the commentators will say, when Krishna says he's dharma, which is not against religious principles, what he's saying is he's sex for the purpose of procreation. And so you get Krishna identifying himself with earth, water, fire, air, ether. He has the taste of water. Earth, fragrance of the earth. Water, the taste of water. Fire, the heat and light of fire. You follow? Air, I'm not sure what he says about air. Ether, he's the sound. Om in the universe, right? Mind, he's the intelligence of the intelligent. Intelligence, he's the mind of those with minds. He's the intelligence of those who are intelligent. And he's Parusham, he's the ability in mankind. Nrishu, he's the ability, and that would tend to be like a false ego. And so Krishna identifies himself with all the things he just mentioned are part of his energy. Now that, and then he gets a little tricky. He says, this is text 12. Know that all states of being, whether they're sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic, whether sattva, rajas, or tamas, these three gunas, they are manifested by my energy. I am in one sense everything, but I'm independent. I'm not under the modes of material nature, for they, on the contrary, are within me. Let's look at the Sanskrit of this also. Ye chaiva sattvika bhava rajasas tamasas chaye. These sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic, states of being. Mata eva iti tanvidi. Know that they come from me. Again, I'm connected to everything in this world, right? Te mai, they are within me. Nat te shuaham, I'm not in them. Do you see this dance where Krishna's trying to not let himself be defined in a pantheistic way, where he merely becomes matter? Can you see this? You see it or not? What do you see?
I see him explaining how the modes of material nature are within him rather than being inherently him.
Good. Right? They emanate from him, but they don't fully encapsulate him. He's more than just the modes of nature. But they're connected to him, because everything's connected to him. Okay, good. All right. Vidhi guna mayai bhavai ebhi sarvam idam jagat. By these three states of being made of the gunas, this entire world, mohitam, is bewildered. Abhijanati, and does not know me. Na abhijanati mam, and does not know me. Ebhya param, who am beyond these modes. Avyayam, and am eternally beyond these modes. See what Krishna's doing there? He's further defining what it means when he says that they are in me, but I'm not in them. He's separating himself. And this is this dexterous dance of separating and connecting. Now, seeing the world as connected to God goes back. There's this thing called Scala Naturi. Scala Naturi. The ladder of nature. The natural order. The natural order. Naturi, Scala. The natural scale. The natural order of things. And this is an idea which goes, again, all the way back to Aristotle. And Plato also, and Neoplatonic philosophers like Proclus and Plotinus, and then medieval Christian theologians. this whole idea, like, I am the light of the sun and the moon, I am the strength of the strong, amongst, mountains, I'm the Himalayas, etc., which sounds so, I don't know, unusual or exotic in a monotheistic, for those who have been raised in a monotheistic type understanding where there's one God. This sounds so weird. But in fact, this was the prevailing idea of all of Christianity, for most of Christianity. There's a Dionysus, the Areopagite, this Neoplatonic philosopher who called himself a disciple of Paul and wrote a few centuries after Jesus, and everybody accepted him as being an authoritative Christian writer. And but it was found out that he was, probably like a Syrian Neoplatonic philosopher that wasn't connected to Paul 400 years ago or something like that. But his book, which laid out the Scala Naturae, became canonical, became sacred for Christians. And so it's funny, but if you were to show this, even if you look at the works of Shakespeare, Iago, the villain in Othello, he says, I do not believe in a God of kings. I believe in a God of knaves, like of peasants. I don't believe there's anything controlling the universe. So the villain in Shakespeare's plays spoke just chaotic modern atheism. And the king, King Lear, I think, said things like, if I love you, my subjects, if I do not love you, then chaos will come. Meaning that a king's duty was to represent God and to love all the subjects on behalf of God because he ruled by divine right. And so there was this idea that the king was divinely decreed to rule. That's why you had, royal dynasties. And so this attempt to break society into, whether it's the three estates of medieval Europe, or it's like the priests, and then the kings, and then the peasants and the mercantile people, that was the third estate, or whether you get the four divisions of the Republic for Plato, there's always this attempt to taxonomize and divide things up. So there was a Scala Naturae. It was God, he's at the top. Then below him are 9 levels of angels. The virtues and the powers and the thrones and the cherubim and the seraphim and you guys familiar with all these? And the angels and the archangels. It's like there's 9 levels of angels. And then below, so the angels are made out of spirit like God is. So you have God and then the angels who are closest to God. And because you see all sorts of plants and all sorts of animals, then there also has to be all sorts of angels, and therefore they came up with this idea of, there's 9 levels of angels. Then there's human beings. Human beings are both spirit and matter mixed together. Then you've got, below that, you've got animals. And then those animals are divided into various categories. Like lower animals would be like, like snakes that just crawl on the ground. But better animals would be like bears that can walk. You follow? Then you got plants, and within plants you've got noble plants, like fruit-bearing trees, and then you have ignoble plants, like thorn bushes or what have you. And then finally you've got minerals, and even within the mineral world you have noble minerals. What would be the example of a noble mineral? Gold or silver. And what would be an example of an ignoble mineral? Lead. And actually alchemy, which of course that's an Islamic word, that's an Arabic word. Anytime you see the word al in front of something, algorithm, algebra, alchemy, it means we borrowed that word from Islam. But whether it's Chinese alchemy, which has existed for thousands of years, and that's Chinese medicine, whether it's Indian alchemy, which it's there in a series of books called the Rasa Siddha literature, but it was also there in tantric literature, and it's even there in Ayurveda. Or whether you're looking at Middle Eastern and Western alchemy, the basic purpose of alchemy was to take low base metals, such as lead, and through an alchemical process turn them into noble metals like gold. That was the idea. It's all based on this scala naturae, that there's a sacred divine order. And so when Krishna identifies himself with the light of the sun and the moon and the ability of man and this and that, it's very common to what you would see in a traditional philosophy, going back all the way to Plato, Aristotle, and all the way up until Shakespeare. So most of the time, pull that plug for me, thank you. Most of the time we don't think like this. It seems unusual. Krishna's identifying himself with the best of something. But if you were to talk to, let's say, a medieval Christian theologian, they would understand exactly what was going on here. Amongst human beings, Krishna would be identified with the king, the best of men. Amongst aquatics, Krishna would be identified with the shark, the best of the aquatics. You get it? Amongst mountains, Krishna would be identified with the Himalayas. Exactly. You get it? So this, we get a little snapshot here. Krishna's going to do it in 40 different categories in the 10th chapter. He does it even in the 8th, 9th chapter a little bit as well. But this idea of Krishna identifying himself with the best of something in the material world is not to indicate that that thing literally is Krishna, because Krishna's already said he's beyond those things. He just said that. But it's to give you some way to begin to orient yourself to look at this material world, instead of being beguiled by this world, to be inspired by the world. To see beauty and power and strength, instead of becoming enamored by that and chasing after it madly, to actually be inspired to the creator of that. To put it in simple terms, Prabhupada was one time asked by somebody who thought that Prabhupada, being a monk, was engaged in some kind of repression or self-abnegation. And they said, can't you just appreciate a beautiful sunset? And Prabhupada's response was to say, imagine how beautiful the person who made the sunset is. That beyond just being enamored by the art, imagine how wonderful the artist must be, who produced such lovely art. And so in many ways, that's the purport to what we're supposed to get from reading these verses. You're supposed to get inspired to look at the material world not in a way where it beguiles you and degrades you and disturbs you, but rather in a way that it inspires you and brings out the best in you, ennobles you, exalts you. And so this scala naturae is it's all over the ancient world. There's like a famous Sanskrit axiom, yata lohe tata dehe. As in metal, as in stone, so also in your own body. The idea that you can find like a Fibonacci type sequence, and when you look and you find certain patterns in nature, those patterns also exist within you as well. Looking for that kind of symmetry, looking for that kind of a physics that helps you better understand the world in which you live. That makes sense? And so then, deluded by the three modes, goodness, passion, ignorance, the whole world does not know me, who am above the modes and inexhaustible. So in addition to Krishna participating in this very traditional philosophical worldview, he's also preserving this idea that the deity is beyond the imperfections of the material world. And somehow or other the material world came from God, but God is beyond that material world. And that doctrine, by the way, in English, is called panentheism. All in God. Pan, all, like Pan American Airlines. And in theos, in God. Everything is within God. If you say everything is within God, you are not saying everything is God. You're saying that everything is within God, therefore everything is dependent on God, but that still leaves room for Krishna to be beyond the mere totality of matter. Krishna can still be beyond the totality of matter. There's still a place for transcendence, that God is beyond everything. And that's critical, because if God is beyond everything, then the material world can be related to Krishna, but Krishna has a level of existence which goes beyond the material world, and you can have your cake and eat it too, and you can have both an immanent philosophy that's right there in front of your face and is valuable right now and you can use right now, and also a transcendent conception of divinity where God goes beyond the limitations of the world. Usually people end up with one of these two. They either end up kind of pagan, pantheistic. That would be, immanence. God as manifested in this world. But then you got the problem of all the imperfections of this world, such as temporality and being under the laws of physics, for example. And then the other option is you say that God is transcendent. And the problem with that is the material world ends up having nothing to do with God, and therefore you have to postulate a devil who's in charge of this world of mammon. And so usually these two traditions are at loggerheads with one another, immanence and transcendence. And people tend to be towards one or the other. And immanent traditions end up being almost materialistic, and transcendent traditions end up all wanting to kill themselves or martyr themselves because everything in this world sucks and you just got to go beyond this world. Extreme forms of transcendent philosophy lead to things like millenarianism, which are these suicide cults that you get cropping up since the dawn of time all around the world in different traditions. You got, Buddhist monks in Cambodia, drinking, poison, and you got, you also got the Branch Davidians and the Heaven's Gate, and and Jonestown. It's just you go anywhere and you get these cults who are so transcendent. This material world sucks so badly. They just can't wait for the deluge, or they can't wait for the fire. They can't wait for the apocalypse, and they end up killing themselves. That's this transcendent philosophy run amok, out of balance. And so what Krishna's trying to say is, hey, I'm everywhere, I'm in everything, but all that stuff put together doesn't equal me. But you can be inspired by it. And how come you can't see me everywhere? Because I'm beyond this world. And this represents my deluding potency, by which souls that want to be deluded can be deluded. It's interesting, but if you think about it, sometimes people might ask you, like they'll say to you, if God's all good and all powerful, how could evil exist? It's a very common thing for people to say. What I'll usually do at that stage in the conversation is I will say, if I can explain to you how God can be both all good and all powerful and evil can exist, are you ready to accept that God exists? And then they'll say, no, I don't believe in God. And I'll say, well, then don't waste my time asking me an intermediate question that it would appear to indicate that if I could solve that for you, then you'd have to believe in God. If there's some other thing, then that's not really your doubt, so why question me on that doubt? You follow? Like if you're trying to make a sale to somebody, right? And you're like, hey, what's stopping you from buying this car right now? What don't well, I have to think about it. You're like, okay, well, tell me. Of course you have to think about it. Let me give you some information so you can think about it. What information can I give you? You follow? And they're like, well, the price. And you're like, okay, so that's the only thing stopping us is the price? So if we could make a price that worked for you and worked for me, then we could close today. And I go, no, it's not the price. Well, then why bring up the price then? Okay, well, so the price is not an issue. So we don't have to talk about price, right? So what's really on your mind? You get it? You get it? So have you ever heard this before? If God's all good and all powerful, then why does suffering exist in this world? You've heard that, right? It's important to say to somebody who asks you that, okay, so let me get this straight. If I answer that question, you're ready to believe in God. And if they're not, then you don't get to ask me that question. Ask me your real question. Where is the evidence that God exists? Something like that, okay? Consciousness is the evidence. And we start to walk down that road with it, no problem. But somebody could say, why would God create a deluding potency? Why would the gunas come from God? Which essentially is the problem of evil, but asked in a Sanskrit way. We don't have a word for evil in Sanskrit, which is nice, because evil's a dumb concept. It's an elegant concept. It's like, you got like, God is good, and then there's all this other stuff I can't figure out, so I postulate the devil and blame it all on him, but then I ignore the fact that everything came from God, and I got to figure out a way to make it all make sense, instead of just taking all the stuff that doesn't work and throw it in like a bad evil bucket, and then postulating a deity that's in charge of all that. And so, it's really the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, the problem of the gunas. Why did God create the gunas? And at which point, you could then ask the question, what would you say? Yeah.
If I can answer that for you, will that resolve all?
Yeah, will that resolve all your doubts about the Gita? Okay, we move forward then. Great, good question. You've articulated a good question. I think it's worthy of an answer, but let me just make sure we're on the same page. If I can answer that question for you, you're losing weight, huh?
Yeah.
You're looking good, man. You're working out too, right?
Every day.
Yeah, you're looking good. Good for you. That Achilles tear made you value your body a little more, didn't it? Yeah, good. Yeah. Why would God make these deluding gunas that bewilder people? They come from Him. He said it. He's beyond them. Why would He create them in the first place? You should all be able to answer that question. Can all of you answer that question? Tell me, Bailey. Bailey's a newbie. So let's see if he can answer.
He created them in the first place because He gave us free will.
Okay. Do you sound authoritative?
No.
Do you sound like an idiot?
Probably.
You do. In which case, I can't even hear anything you're saying, because your tone of voice sounds so filled with trepidation and unsure of yourself. I can't actually hear what you're saying. It's painful. It's like difficult for me to listen to what you're saying because your delivery sucks so bad. It's so unconvincing that even if you said the right thing, I'm inclined to disbelieve you. So it's just an unfortunate reality that if you want to answer questions anywhere, anytime, forever, for the rest of your life, you have to display a modicum of confidence. For example, if I was to say, I can answer the question if Krishna created the gunas because there's a good reason for them. Do you hear how my voice goes up at the end? You hear that? How does that make me sound? Weak and unsure of myself. How about if I say the exact same words? I can answer the question. How Krishna created the gunas. And they're compatible with His transcendence. Here, I lower my voice at the end of my sentence. There you go. If I whisper at you, is that going to convince anybody? No. It's like you're ashamed of the words coming out of your mouth, so you whisper them. So just be as shy as you need to be and kind of yell at people. You follow? It's just you got to do that. Otherwise, it makes it really tough to even hear what you're saying. Do you remember the question?
No, you asked me to answer.
Oh, dude, you lost. That's it. Can't remember the question? Can't answer it. Killing me. Yeah, I'm assuming you can answer. I mean, I don't want to embarrass you in front of your dad. If you can't answer, I can't do this to you in front of your old man. I'm not going to like... I'm not, even if you give me a lousy answer, I'm going to have to be like, good job, son, and like, right on. But anyway, go for it. Give it a go.
Well, people want to be God. They want to lord over, material nature. They want to be the enjoyer. So Krishna made a world where you can do that.
Yes, excellent. I wouldn't say people want to be God. Because if you say people want to be God, what can my response be? I'm sorry?
Nuh-uh.
Yeah, you say, no, I don't.
You want to be the enjoyer.
You see how if you knock it down a notch and you're a little less ambitious and a little less almost like soapboxy, and you just keep it a little more even and a little less preacher-esque, you have a more... They aren't going to get hung up on those little things they can quibble with you over.
Yeah.
So you can say... I would frame it a little differently. I would say, an all-good God would want to create the best of all possible worlds. You should actually memorize that statement. The best of all possible worlds. Would an all-good God want to create the best of all possible worlds? Of course. It's part of being all good. Could an all-powerful God create the best of all possible worlds? It could. Therefore, if God was all good, if God existed and was all good and all powerful, we would live in the best of all possible worlds. Would the best of all possible worlds have the potential for love within it? The answer is yes. Does love require free will? The answer is yes. Does free will mean that we would all have to have free will? The answer is yes. So the best of all possible worlds would be a world with the possibility of love, which would require free will, which would mean we'd all have free will. You following me? If you have free will, could you choose to turn away from divinity? The answer is yes. At least hypothetically you could, because if you have free will, you would have to be able to turn away from divinity. You following this? If you chose to turn away from divinity, and God was the source and substratum of everything, would you ever be able to truly turn away from God? The answer is no. Would Krishna then, to allow you to exercise your free will, have to beguile you so you wouldn't realize what was actually happening? The answer is yes. Therefore, Krishna, being all good, would have wanted to create the best of all possible worlds. Krishna, being all powerful, could create the best of all possible worlds. The best of all possible worlds would have love and therefore free will. Free will means you could choose to turn towards divinity or away from divinity, but because God is everywhere, you can't actually literally turn away from divinity, and therefore there would have to be a delusion so that you could at least think you were turning away from divinity, which would be part of God's seeding of his own omnipotence to allow you some degree of potency and independence such that you had enough free will to choose to love him. And therefore, rather than the potential for delusion or diluting energy in the world being antagonistic towards the existence of God, properly understood, it's absolutely required for God to exist. It's absolutely required for the existence of an all-good and all-powerful God. A world without illusion, without the ability for you to beguile yourself and waste your time, would be incongruent with an all-good and all-powerful God based on the logic I just deployed, and therefore we must live in a world with delusion. Did you follow that? It's essentially what you said. Nothing you said was incorrect, and what you said was a very simple, good answer. I just want to give you guys a 360 of what it looks like as an actual formula. Does that make sense? But that delusion would have to be God's lower nature as opposed to his higher nature. It would have to be somewhat distinct from him as opposed to his fundamental essence. You get it? And now you have room for both immanence and transcendence. And then we're at verse 14. Daiva hi esha guna mayi Mama Maya Duratyaya. Daiva hi esha gunamayi. This divine delusional potency made up of the gunas. This bewildering potency made up of the gunas. Mama. My bewildering potency made up of the gunas. It's mine. Mama Maya. It's my energy. Mama Maya. This energy made up of the three gunas is actually my energy. Duratyaya. And it's difficult to overcome. Mam eva ye prapadyante. But one who approaches me. Mayam etam tarantite. They can cross beyond this Maya. This illusion of mine, made up of the gunas, is difficult to overcome. But if you step towards me or approach me directly, if you take shelter of me, then it's possible to cross beyond it. This is interesting as well, because let's say that there was a deity that created illusion out of a desire to satisfy us, and we had that free will, then there'd have to be a hack. Wouldn't all good God want you to be able to overcome Maya? Yes. Couldn't all good God make it powerful? Yes. Couldn't all powerful God make it possible? Yes. And so you have here the core of Bhakti. That the solution to the material problem is to turn towards divinity, to take shelter of divinity, to cry out, to supplicate, to take shelter, to surrender, to reach out to a higher power, a force greater than oneself. If that force is all good, it wants to help you, and if it's all powerful, it can. And this is the core of Bhakti, which amazingly is a response to the problem of material existence, which Krishna just so well articulated. What's amazing is that this ontology, this theory of what exists that Krishna just laid out over 13 verses, now leads to bhakti directly. Very obviously, in a very straightforward way. Which again is in line with this chapter. Chatur vidha, let's read the translation. This divine energy of mind, consisting of the three modes of material nature, is difficult to overcome, but those who've surrendered unto me can easily cross beyond it. We're going to go back to text 15. We're going to skip to text 16 real quick. We'll go back to 15. Chatur vidha bhajante mam. Four kinds of people worship me. Bhajante, they worship mam, me. And bhaj is where you get the word bhakti from. So it means four kinds of people do bhakti to me. Sukritinu, four kinds of pious people worship me. Now, let's just, for fun, why don't you think about why you turned towards God as a child in the religion you were born into, why you turned towards God as an adult, why you turn towards God now. Think about that for a moment. Let's take 30 seconds. You think about what has been your motivation for turning to God, what's your current motivation for turning to God, but especially what was your motivation for starting a spiritual sojourn, thinking that there might be something out there, turning towards divinity, worshiping God, investigating religion. Artha, jigyasa, Arti, Jnani. Arti, you are suffering. The material world's not working for you. You figure there's got to be something better than this. And so you turn towards divinity. Or you're suffering so bad you cry out. There's no atheist in the foxhole. And most people haven't wound up in a foxhole in life. But most people, at least if you're raised in the West, have gotten drunk and vomited, drunk, or at least maybe been sick, so sick. My daughter had a stomach flu a couple days ago, and we almost took her to the hospital. Because stomach flus are dicey for a small child, because they're just vomiting, and they can't hold anything down. At a certain point, they get dehydrated, and you got to put them on some fluids. You got to give them an IV with some fluids, because if you get too dehydrated, it's real problematic. But then the thing is, if you let a kid drink how much they want to drink, they'll just continue to yak, having an almost like allergic reaction, like you take Benadryl sometimes. So just stop them from drinking, and then they have to suffer without being able to drink for hours, and you have to give them like a thimbleful of liquid, and then 2 thimbles full of liquid. You got to nurse them back to where they can hold stuff down. It gets dicey. We had a hummingbird come to the temple yesterday because we opened up these windows, and we should have left those fans on, shouldn't we? I thought it was like all like going to be cool in here, but I was like completely wrong. We had a hummingbird come in here, and of course they're attracted to red. If we open the window, the hummingbird flies in. They're attracted to red. We had like red decorations up in the temple, like all over the place, like streamers. Like 500 feet of streamers running back and forth, made out of cloth. And so it was just hanging out there, and we turned off all the lights, but it was so high I couldn't see that we left the lights on in there, and we just wouldn't leave. But hummingbirds, they need to eat all the time, otherwise they go into this paralyzed state. They die. And so this hummingbird caught here. We spent like 4 hours trying to get rid of it. We took down all the decorations. I mean, that's how bad it was. And then he couldn't fly so high anymore, so he started flying a little lower. Then we turned off all the lights. Then he flew into the foyer. Then we quickly shut the doors, went in the foyer, opened up the next doors, and coaxed him out. He had a hard time getting out of the foyer, too. It took like 5 minutes to get him out of the foyer. But yeah, we were worried because, we had sugar water out for him, but he was too spastic to find it and drink it. So it was a whole thing. And my daughter had that stomach flu and couldn't drink. At some point, you get sick enough with a stomach flu, and you're yakking your guts out, and your stomach's like wrenching, and you start to pray. You ever had that happen?
Yeah.
Almost everybody. Or you get intoxicated and you're puking your guts out, and you're laying your head on a toilet, which you would never do. Like normally, you're feeling like, oh, it feels cool, and like the cool porcelain of the toilet feels. But normally you would never do that. But at a certain level of drunken stupor, you're suffering so badly, just all your decorum goes out the window. So people turn to God because they're just suffering so much. They cry out for something higher, for mercy. Jigyasa. They're curious. They're interested, like, is there anything out there? They're curious. And then arti. They're looking for wealth. One is they're trying to mitigate suffering, the other ones are trying to enjoy. They're thinking they want to enjoy. It's maybe a little less kind of a Western thing, but this whole like manifesting phenomenon, you're looking for something. You can't buy everything. You can't buy, like, for instance, you can't buy like a clean biopsy. There's things in life that happen. You can't buy a kid without birth defects. There's certain things you want and you can't buy it. You can't get it by the sweat off your own back. And so you look to God for those things. And then jnana. You're searching for knowledge. you're looking for knowledge. Either you're suffering too much, you turn towards divinity. Or you want to enjoy, you turn towards divinity. Or you're curious, you turn towards divinity. Or you're actually in search of knowledge, and you turn towards divinity. I think this is a brilliant verse, and we're running out of time, but I think it's a brilliant verse precisely because I've never met anybody where this isn't why they got interested in spirituality. Every person I've ever met who's interested in spirituality is interested for one of these 4 reasons or a combination. And so it's far out. Krishna lays out an ontology that leads naturally to the idea that you need a hack in the form of bhakti, and then lays out the 4 kinds of people who get involved in bhakti. Then he's going to tell you 4 kinds of people who don't get bhakti, so you know what to avoid. And he's going to tell you amongst those 4 kinds of people who turn towards him, which one's the best. The one who's the best is the one who's searching for knowledge. Because being curious, it's a little whimsical. And if you're trying to get rid of suffering, then when you're done suffering, you're good. And if you're looking for something good, then when you get that good thing, you're done. Like sometimes people, they're devotees and they get a boyfriend or a girlfriend and they just bounce. They're just gone. Like they were never here. Like zip. It happens. And so, or they make some money and they're out. The devotee gets rich and they're good. Come to the temple for Janmashtami or something like that. Or you're curious and then you move on to something else. You're curious about something else. But if you're searching for the truth, that's going to propel you forever towards divinity. Nothing else will satisfy. That leads you to things like the only solution for the problem of the material world is to take shelter of divinity. That's the fountain of youth. That's the elixir of immortality. That's the touchstone. That's the universal solvent. That's what I've always been looking for. That's the relationship. That's the endless love. That's the relationship I was always looking for. I've been misplacing my love in people in this material world, but that's like I'm going to repose my loving propensity in an unlimitedly lovable deity who has an unlimited capacity to reciprocate with me. That's the core of bhakti. So it's quite fascinating. Krishna lays out a vision of what exists that's quite, it's like a primitive physics. Postulates spirit as being an irreducible part of reality. Explains how everything comes from him. Dexterously dances around that with panentheism, which is like a really advanced doctrine of theology that's first articulated in the world in the Upanishads and only entered the English language in the 1820s, like through German. It was 1850s by the time it got into English. And then points to the solution to the problem of how to get around this beguiling potency, which is to turn towards divinity and reach out to a higher power, which, has made the whole 12-step program successful. And then articulates 4 kinds of people who do that. And then 4 kinds of people who don't, so you know what to do and what not to do. You can track your progress, and it even gives you a hierarchy within the people who turn towards. 4 kinds of pious, this is text 16. 4 kinds of pious men, of course, it's also women. Begin to render devotional service to me. The distressed, the desire of wealth, the inquisitive, and he who is searching for knowledge of the Absolute. Thank you, IGTV. Feedback?